Distinguished delegates in this very august gathering, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a pleasure to be in the midst of this very august gathering today. I take this opportunity to commend the efforts and the initiatives of NAR India and APRA, both, to have put together this very inspiring event, if I may say so. It's very difficult to really identify where to start and where to end in a debate of this kind or in an exposition on this subject. It's complex, it is challenging. A lot of issues which have been outlined by my previous speaker, Mr. Jain, are very thought-provoking. Not that they have not been spoken about earlier, but we have not been able to find solutions yet. The housing finance sector has grown over the last 2 decades, and more particularly, specifically since the turn of the century. There has been considerable expansion in the flow of funds into housing. There has been expansion in the supply of housing, both through institutional funds as well as through non-institutional funds. We have been able to integrate the housing finance market with the broader economy, with the broader financial system, not only domestic, but also global. And this has been part and parcel of the growth story of the Indian economy for the past 15 years or so, since the early 90s. There has been one disconnect in all this story, and that's where I'll pick up the thread from and try and see if I can, with some effort, try and put the challenges in certain perspectives, and which is very important. The disconnect is that when the economy of the country embarked upon the reform process in the early 90s, majority of the sectors were opening up to the domestic and the international market forces. The financial sector particularly, which was a very sheltered sector and protected, started opening out to the broader market forces. The real estate sector and the real estate financing sector, as the financing arm of the real estate or financing arm of the housing, was also part and parcel of this financial system. Until the reform process happened, there were a large number of other sectors who were beneficiaries of different kinds of supports and subventions and subsidies from the government, whether it was agriculture sector or the export sectors, SSI, small scale industry sector, small and medium enterprises sector, except housing. Nothing much had happened in the housing sector. A very few institutions who were actually specializing in housing finance and who were on the ground acting. Banks were very negative on the housing sector. They had other priorities. Housing was not in the priority list. Housing was typically taken as a social sector and government responsible. It was looked at as something which would be the sole responsibility of the government. The point which I'm trying to make here is that the transition from the government supported or the perception about the housing sector to government supported sector or a financial sector supported sector had not happened while the reforms started unfolding. That has had a both positive and a negative effect on the housing sector, in the sense that before the housing sector really came on the center stage, or before the forces within the housing sector started playing out into the broader economy, the liberalization and the reform process was already on. Other sectors had already benefited from the sheltered or the priority status of the government and the financial sector and had advanced pretty much. Housing sector was neither a priority sector, funds had not flown into the housing, The lenders didn't know how to appraise housing loans, what the housing sector looked like. And the reform process came in. So housing sector had to compete with other sectors on very non-level playing field. That was the beginning of the exposure of the housing finance market to the broader reform process and the economic liberalization process. However, with the sustained efforts of the financing institutions and the economy becoming very, very demand and consumer driven, the supply side got activated. The consumer drive or the demand driven potential of the economy also became visible in the housing market. At the same time, fortunately, the growth in the GDP that started showing significant year-on-year growth, with overall disposable income of different segments of the economy, different segments of the sector, the population rising city after city. Now, growth story is old. I'm not going to dwell on that. But the impact of that was essentially on the consumer-driven economy. And that's where we saw a big change in the housing market as well. The consumer drive and the individual demand-driven economy, demand-driven sector started throwing up results on the supply side, whether it was supply of housing credit or it was supply of housing constructed units. So essentially we have seen the supply responses coming forth in the housing sector, and year-on-year growth in the housing credit has been about 25%. But the big, I would say the game-changing phenomenon which happened in the housing sector was in the year 2002-03 and 3-4, when the banking sector came into housing in a big way. That was the time when the other sectors were down and out. There's not much credit offtake in other sectors. Housing sector was doing well. It was demonstrated by the specialized housing finance institutions, who are in number 55 today, that housing finance is good business, it's sustainable business, a very contained non-performing assets, and it was backed by housing credit was backed by an asset which was a permanent asset. It was also considerable contribution to the GDP of the economy. Everything was demonstrated. The banks, in fact, not finding enough potential in other sectors, they looked at housing with a lot of interest. And that was the year of huge growth in quantum of credit, quantum of funds coming into the housing sector. Prior to that, we had a large number of specialized housing finance institutions who were extending housing credit, but with the banks, with all the funds at their command coming into this housing, it gave a huge fillip to the credit gaps in the housing finance market. And from that time on, the banks haven't looked back. The year-on-year growth has been substantive, to the extent that it has raised concerns for the regulators and the policymakers that probably too much funds is flowing into the sector and which is overheating the economy. There has been proactive and reactive regulatory interventions in this field by the regulators, which all our friends are very much aware about. But the short point here is that, well, every actor has to play its own role, and regulators, I think we must give the due credit to them, that the housing finance sector today, despite whatever has happened in the international arena, has not rubbed on the Indian housing finance, the Indian credit market yet. And we hope that with a good amount of protection and proactive role of the regulators, the sector will certainly move from strength to strength over the coming years.